Welcome to the presentation. In this presentation we're really covering two topics: SharePoint 2010 data access options and link to SharePoint. As you can see from the slide, my contact details are here. You can follow me on Twitter. My blog details are there. It's really made for developers and architects of SharePoint 2010 and the occasional interesting post around technology such as Windows Phone 7. You can see my email address there, so if anybody wants to get hold of me or ask me any questions, please feel free to do so. The agenda for the evening goes as follows. Firstly, we're going to look at SharePoint lists and compare them to traditional database tables. We're then going to look at the SharePoint 2010 data access options that are available. Then we look at link to SharePoint and look at points of interest and key takeaways so you can get into the technology really quickly and avoid common pitfalls and mistakes. We look at basic operations, the basic CRUD operations, so how to read, write, update, delete your list data. Lastly, we look at a demonstration and we look at setting up link to SharePoint, running the SP2010 tool, and we look at actually working with a generated proxy code. Let's take a look at SharePoint 2010 lists. SharePoint stores all its data in lists. This is similar to how SQL Server or database uses database tables to hold actual list item data. What I'm going to do here is compare SharePoint lists to database tables and show you the advantages of one technique versus using database tables. Obviously, SharePoint lists has built-in security and permissions, so you don't have to go and recreate all of this. It's all ready to go. You can attach workflows to SharePoint lists. You have versioning, so unlike in database tables, you'd create tomb tables or a history and then hook some sort of recording system to it, which can make them pretty heavy and get them to lock occasionally. You have versioning built in. You've got very good Office integration, so your users like using Word and Excel and other Office tools. They can continue using these tools and it will hook seamlessly into SharePoint. It's a very easy setup. There's a UI. You can set up lists through the UI. You can do it declaratively through programming in C# and get your lists as you want them and reusable. And SharePoint generates a user interface. This user interface is very useful on things like lists, as you have a backend for administrators and people working with your data to actually set up your lists. So even if you're building a custom application, you have a really good starting point. I'm going to look at database tables now, and you're going to see the advantages of why you wouldn't really want to use a SharePoint list. Firstly, it's not SharePoint lists aren't transactional, whereas database tables transactions can be transactional. So a common example is a banking application where you have one account having money drawn out and another account where money is deposited. Using SharePoint, you'd have to manually check that both transactions go through and then rewind out or reverse out if it doesn't happen. Obviously, using a transaction in SQL Server allows you to push through this transaction of removing the money and inserting it into the new table. And if it doesn't work successfully, the whole transaction is automatically rolled out for you. Performance and higher transaction volumes within a database table, you'll get much better performance going directly to a database and using stored procs and using the traditional developer mechanisms that we've been taught over the last 15 years. Saying that, SharePoint lists have become a lot more performant in SharePoint 2010, and it is definitely moving towards being more performant and suitable for application and composite application development. The next advantage that database tables have over SharePoint lists is distinct queries and aggregations. You don't get as many aggregations as you do in database tables, and database tables are made for crunching and looking at data. You don't get that in SharePoint lists. Saying that, you can return data out of SharePoint lists, and you can use something like link to objects, which can further help you aggregate and roll up your data. But if you were looking to do hardcore number crunching, you definitely want to rather go for a database table and pull that then through SharePoint. You have much greater flexibility in your database design. You can use a lot more connected tables. SharePoint lists, when querying them, have a limit in how many tables you can actually connect to one another. And it becomes very slow as soon as you start doing lookups. To alleviate this problem, SharePoint Lists actually has a feature called projected columns. So if you were working in, let's say, an orders orders list, and there were items in this orders list, you could actually do a lookup from, let's say, your order items, and not only do you have to give it the item ID, you could actually say the person who actually performed that order, which would be done at an order level, and you can project that down. So you don't actually then have to do a relational lookup to get that data. So you do have certain advantages in SharePoint Lists, but you can only really use these projected columns to a certain extent. Obviously, database tables we've been using for years, and your developers like them and know what they can and can't do with them. You don't have that in SharePoint Lists. However, they are fairly similar, and you should be able to move over to SharePoint Lists. Taking a look at SharePoint 2010 Data Access, we have various options available to us, and this shows you them from sort of a 50,000 foot overview of what your options available are. So in the middle of the slide, you have really the SharePoint farm. That's the area marked data platform. So you got the farm, your site collections, your list data, and external lists, which is data which is held, let's say, within SharePoint or web services or your existing lines of business or your SAP system. You can hook to all of this from within SharePoint, or you can just surface it through SharePoint. The top part of the slide shows the client applications that you can build. So what that means is you can build an application, for example, a .NET application, and then you can actually talk to a SharePoint farm that is, or various SharePoint farms if you want, from your client applications. So this is really broken down into different areas. You get the client object model, and you get the traditional way of doing this, which is through web services, and you also now get the REST APIs. All the areas marked with the star are new to SharePoint 2010. So the client object model actually interacts with the Windows Communication Framework and opens up APIs through the SVC extension. You have three options for using the client object model. Two of them are managed code, which is the Silverlight, and the .NET managed code, CLR. And you also have a JavaScript option. So if you wanted to connect, let's say, from a PHP application or something completely outside of .NET, you would use the JavaScript option to speak to SharePoint to go and get list data. You also have the REST APIs, so that's the representational state transfer APIs. This is strongly typed. You can go and get data very easily using JSON objects, which are returned to the client application. A very useful new method of working with SharePoint data. We'll take a look at a slide later on which actually compares all of these options and really helps you decide which one to use in your projects. The bottom part of the slide looks at your server-side access. So this is really when you are on the SharePoint farm already. So the main area here is your server object model, and that's not new to SharePoint 2010. That was around in SharePoint 2007. And it's a very good API. And you can do pretty much everything you need to from the server-side object model. However, accessing lists is extremely slow using the server-side object model. So you do get certain entities that have been built within the object model to allow you to query list data. So using the API, you use Camel and you use SP query if you're within this current site collection. You can cross site collections, of course, as well using the server-side object model. But you go and write Camel, and Camel then will go and query your lists. Now Camel has a lot of drawbacks, and we'll go through all of these, but Camel is really a markup language. It's kind of like transaction SQL, but it's all XML based, and it gets pretty complicated, but very powerful. Obviously accessing list data using your server object model is weakly typed, so you don't really know if you've got it right at compile time. The last thing we're going to just look at here is the link to SharePoint. We go into quite a lot of detail throughout this presentation on this. Link to SharePoint is language integration query coming from the normal link providers that you get from Microsoft. So you get link to objects, link to XML, link to SQL is very common, and link to SharePoint just really allows you to map object orientation coding techniques onto list data. So it's sort of your glue between your link is your glue between your data and using object orientation coding. Okay. So as you can see, web services aren't new. You could use client-side apps. You just had to write a lot of the code yourself, and it took a lot longer. Now that we've taken a look at all the data access options in SharePoint 2010, we're going to drill down to using the client object model. You have three options for using the client object model. You have the two manage code options, which is the .NET CLR and the Silverlight CLR. Lastly, you have the JavaScript option to use from your client object model. You really pick what you're working in. So if you would like a Silverlight application, go for that. If you're using .NET, obviously the .NET CLR is the right one. If you're outside of that, you'd go for the JavaScript option. The diagram below shows sort of the life cycle of the process that we go through of using the client object model. Sorry, before I go on any further, the client object model is a subset of the server object model. You can pretty much do anything you can do in the server object model. You're now just doing it from a remote client application. So the key takeaway to take away when using the client object model is you write all your commands and then you batch them up and execute them in one big query. Whereas on the server side object model, as you write a line of code and it's executed, it's actually implemented instantaneously. Okay, so let's quickly have a look at this diagram here, which explains how the client object model actually interacts with the SharePoint database. Firstly, you have your client application, which is using one of these client object models. So you write your various commands. So you'd say, like, let's get some data from lists, various lists, and then you, within that context, you'd actually execute your query in one batch, and that sends an HTTP request over to the SharePoint server, which is listening using a web communication framework service. And for instance, for list data, you'd actually use listdata.svc. The data is pushed over in XML format. The web service in turn takes the request, services the request using the client object model. The listdata.svc once again actually compiles your data into a response, and it gives it in a JSON response back to your client object model, which in turn will work with the JSON objects that it receives. Continuing on building client applications that talk to SharePoint 2010, I'm going to show you quickly the REST APIs. This uses the Windows Communication Framework, and you can see it by the extension SVC, to offer up services such as list data to client applications. So you can make a REST call here to an orders table or orders list, SharePoint list, and you can ask for the tax property on that list. The data, it's pretty straightforward, the syntax to go and get it. So if you're used to any querying language, you can work it out fairly simply, and there's a list you can just look at on the internet, and it's actually a very good way to go and get list data. I've also got to mention web services. Web services were around in SharePoint 2007. It's a very good method for offering up the entire SharePoint platform to your applications. It still exists. It's not new to SharePoint 2010, and it shouldn't be overlooked.